Human Baby waved an ambulance for a wounded bear cub and rode it to the hospital. What happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the small town of Willowbrook as 17-month-old Ruby Martinez sat by her grandmother's kitchen window. Her tiny fingers pressed against the cool glass while she watched the world outside with curious brown eyes. Ruby's grandmother, Carmen Martinez, hummed softly while preparing breakfast, unaware that this ordinary Tuesday would change their lives forever. Ruby had always been different from other babies. She never cried without reason, and somehow she seemed to understand things that adults couldn't explain. When birds fell from their nests, Ruby would point and make soft sounds until someone helped them. When the neighbor's cat got stuck under the porch, Ruby crawled to the exact spot and tapped the ground until her grandmother found the trapped animal. Carmen often told her daughter Sophia that Ruby had the gift, the same gift Carmen's own grandmother possessed in rural Mexico, where people said she could speak to animals without words. But Sophia, a busy nurse at Willowbrook General Hospital, dismissed it as coincidence. That morning, Ruby suddenly stopped playing with her wooden blocks and crawled to the window with urgent determination. She pulled herself up on wobbly legs and pressed both palms against the glass, making soft, worried sounds that Carmen had never heard before. "Mija, what is it?" Carmen wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to see what had captured Ruby's attention. Outside, the forest that bordered their backyard seemed peaceful. Birds chirped in the oak trees, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. But Ruby continued making those strange, almost mournful sounds, as if she was trying to communicate something important. Carmen picked up her granddaughter, but Ruby squirmed and pointed toward the forest. Her little face scrunched up with worry, and she began making sounds that resembled whimpering. Not her own whimpering, but as if she was mimicking something else. "There's nothing there, Bebe," Carmen said gently, but Ruby's distress only grew stronger. Suddenly, a faint cry echoed from the woods. Not a bird's call, not a human voice, but something that made Carmen's heart skip. Ruby immediately stopped her own sounds and listened intently, her head tilted like she was having a conversation that only she could understand. The cry came again, weaker this time, filled with pain and fear. Carmen's breath caught in her throat as she realized Ruby hadn't been making random sounds. She had been responding to something calling for help from the forest. "Dios mío," Carmen susurró, cruzándose con una mano mientras sostenía a Ruby con la otra. "How did you hear that, mija? How did you know?" Ruby looked up at her grandmother with eyes that seemed far too wise for a baby, then turned back toward the window and placed her tiny hand on the glass again. This time, her touch left a small handprint that seemed to glow in the morning light, and Carmen felt a chill run down her spine as she realized her granddaughter was trying to tell her something that would sound impossible to anyone else. The forest held a secret, and somehow Ruby already knew what it was. Carmen's hands trembled as she held Ruby closer, but the baby continued to stare into the woods with an intensity that made Carmen's skin crawl. The cry came again, and this time it was clearly the sound of an animal in distress. Ruby responded immediately with her own soft sounds, almost like she was trying to comfort whatever was out there. "We need to call someone," Carmen muttered, reaching for her phone, but Ruby grabbed her grandmother's finger and squeezed it tight, shaking her head with surprising force for such a small child. Ruby pointed toward the back door and made walking motions with her fingers. She wanted them to go outside, to go toward whatever was crying in the forest. Carmen felt her heart racing as she looked at her granddaughter's determined face. "No, mija, it could be dangerous," Carmen said. But Ruby's eyes filled with tears, not the angry tears of a frustrated toddler, but the heartbroken tears of someone who knew another living thing was suffering. Those tears broke Carmen's resolve. She had seen that same expression on her own grandmother's face 60 years ago in Mexico, when Abuela Rosa would disappear into the mountains for hours to help injured animals that only she could find. The gift was real, and it had skipped a generation to land on this precious baby. Carmen grabbed her sweater and Ruby's little jacket. "Okay, but we stay close to the house," she whispered, though something deep in her bones told her they wouldn't be staying close to anything familiar. As soon as they stepped outside, Ruby became more animated. She pointed toward a narrow path that Carmen had never noticed before. Even though she had lived in this house for 3 years, the path seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight, lined with wildflowers that hadn't been there yesterday. They walked for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes. Ruby crawled ahead on the soft forest floor, stopping every few feet to listen and make her gentle sounds. Each time she called out, the distant crying grew a little stronger, a little more hopeful. Finally, they reached a small clearing where ancient oak trees formed a natural circle. In the center, huddled against a fallen log, was the most heartbreaking sight Carmen had ever seen. A tiny bear cub, no bigger than Ruby herself, lay on its side with blood matting the fur around its left shoulder. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, and its dark eyes were clouded with pain and fear. But the moment Ruby appeared at the edge of the clearing, the cub's ears perked up and it tried to lift its head. "Santa Maria, Madre de Dios," Carmen breathed, instinctively backing away, but Ruby had already started crawling toward the injured animal. "Ruby, no!" Carmen called. But her granddaughter turned back with such a look of calm authority that Carmen's protest died in her throat. Ruby reached the cub and gently placed her tiny hand on its uninjured side. The bear cub immediately relaxed, its breathing becoming less labored. Ruby began making soft humming sounds, the same melody Carmen used to sing to her when she was fussy. The cub responded with weak whimpers that sounded almost like it was trying to sing along. Carmen watched in amazement as her granddaughter seemed to have an entire conversation with the injured bear. Ruby would make sounds, wait for the cub's response, then make different sounds. After several minutes of this exchange, Ruby looked back at her grandmother and pointed toward the house, then made urgent gestures. "You want me to get help?" Carmen asked, and Ruby nodded vigorously. But as Carmen turned to leave, she heard something that made her blood run cold, heavy breathing and the crack of branches coming from the other side of the clearing. She turned to see a massive shape moving through the trees, the mother bear, and she was headed straight for them. Ruby heard it too, but instead of being afraid, she looked toward the approaching sound and made a series of complex sounds that seemed almost like she was speaking bear language. The crashing sound stopped abruptly, and Carmen could see the large dark shape of the mother bear standing just at the edge of the clearing, watching them. For several long moments nobody moved. Then Ruby made one more soft sound, and incredibly, the mother bear sat down. She didn't come closer, but she didn't leave either. She just watched as Ruby continued to comfort her injured baby. Carmen realized that somehow, impossibly, her granddaughter had just told a wild bear that she was trying to help, and the mother bear had understood and trusted her. But Ruby's next actions shocked Carmen even more. The baby looked directly at her grandmother and said her first clear word, "Help." Not "mama" or "abuela" like most babies. Her first word was "help," spoken while her hand rested on a dying bear cub, with the cub's mother watching from the shadows. Carmen knew that everything about their quiet life was about to change, and that this moment would be burned into her memory forever. Ruby had found her purpose, and it was bigger than anything Carmen could have imagined. The sound of a distant siren caught Carmen's attention, though she hadn't called for help yet. Ruby heard it too, and immediately became excited, pointing toward the sound and clapping her hands. Somehow, she knew help was coming, even before Carmen knew they would need it. The siren grew closer, and Carmen realized it was headed toward their street. Ruby clapped again and made happy sounds to the bear cub, who seemed to understand that rescue was on the way. But how could Ruby have known an ambulance was coming? And why was it coming to their quiet neighborhood on a Tuesday morning when no one had called for help? The siren grew louder, and Carmen felt her heart pounding as she looked between her granddaughter, the injured cub, and the massive mother bear still watching from the tree line. Ruby seemed completely calm, continuing to hum to the bear cub while making gentle stroking motions on its fur. The cub's breathing had actually improved since Ruby arrived, though the wound on its shoulder still looked serious. Carmen's phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter Sophia. "Mom, I'm in the ambulance, heading to your street. Mrs. Henderson called 911 about strange animal sounds coming from the forest behind your house. She thought someone might be hurt. Are you and Ruby okay?" Carmen stared at the message in disbelief. Mrs. Henderson lived 6 houses down and was nearly deaf. How could she have heard the bear cub's cries from that distance? And why had Sophia been assigned to this call when she usually worked different shifts? Ruby suddenly looked up at Carmen and pointed toward the house, then made walking motions with her fingers again. This time, her meaning was clear. They needed to get the bear cub to the ambulance, but how could they move an injured wild animal with its protective mother watching? As if reading her grandmother's thoughts, Ruby turned toward the mother bear and made a series of sounds that were somehow both gentle and authoritative. The large bear stood up slowly, and Carmen held her breath, certain they were about to be attacked. Instead, the mother bear took several steps forward and carefully picked up her cub by the scruff of its neck, the way mother cats carry their kittens. The cub whimpered softly, but allowed itself to be carried. Ruby clapped her hands and made encouraging sounds, and incredibly, the mother bear began walking toward the path that led back to Carmen's house. "This can't be happening," Carmen whispered, but she found herself following the bizarre procession. A wild bear carrying her injured baby, guided by a 17-month-old human child who seemed to be conducting an impossible conversation between species. As they reached the edge of Carmen's backyard, the ambulance pulled into the driveway. Sophia jumped out of the passenger side, her medical bag in hand, but stopped dead when she saw the scene unfolding before her. "Mama, what in God's name?" Sophia started, but her words died as she watched Ruby toddle toward the ambulance while making urgent sounds toward the mother bear. The bear gently set her cub down on the grass about 10 feet from the ambulance. The paramedic driving, a young man named Derek Thompson, stepped out and immediately froze when he saw the wild animals. "Nobody move," Derek said quietly, reaching for his radio, but Ruby had other plans. The baby crawled between the humans and the bears, placing one tiny hand on the injured cub and extending her other hand toward the ambulance. She looked directly at Sophia and said her second word ever. "Hurt." Sophia stared at her daughter in shock. Ruby had never shown any interest in talking before, and now she was clearly communicating about the bear cub's injury. The mother bear made a low rumbling sound, and Ruby responded with her own soft sounds that somehow seemed reassuring. She's talking to them," Sophia whispered to her mother. "She's been talking to them all morning," Carmen replied. "The cub called to her, Mija. She heard it from inside the house and led me right to where it was hurt." Derek slowly approached, his medical training overriding his fear. "Ma'am, that bear cub needs medical attention, but we can't transport wild animals. We need to call animal control." Ruby heard the word "can't" and immediately became distressed. She looked at the injured cub, then at the ambulance, then back at Derek with tears forming in her eyes. She crawled to Derek's feet and tugged on his uniform pants, pointing back at the bear cub while making urgent sounds. The mother bear watched this interaction with what could only be described as understanding. When Ruby started crying, the large bear actually took a step closer and made a gentle huffing sound, as if trying to comfort the human baby who was trying to help her child. "This is insane," Derek muttered, but he knelt down to examine the bear cub from a safe distance. The wound looks like it was caused by something sharp, maybe broken glass or metal. It's deep but not life-threatening if we can stop the bleeding and prevent infection. Sophia knelt beside her daughter. "Ruby, baby, what do you want us to do?" Ruby pointed at the ambulance, then at the bear cub, then made driving motions with her hands. Her message was clear. She wanted the bear cub to go to the hospital. "We can't take a wild animal to the hospital," Sophia said gently, but Ruby shook her head vigorously and crawled back to the bear cub. What happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Ruby placed both hands on the injured cub and began making sounds that weren't quite human and weren't quite animal. Something in between that seemed to come from a deeper place than her throat. The bear cub's eyes, which had been glazed with pain, suddenly became bright and alert. It struggled to sit up and nuzzled Ruby's cheek with its small snout. The mother bear made a sound that Derek would later describe as the most heartbreaking thing he'd ever heard, a mother's plea for help that transcended species. Then she did something that no one could have predicted. The massive bear walked slowly to the back of the ambulance and sat down next to the open doors, looking directly at the humans as if asking permission to load her baby inside. Ruby clapped her hands and looked at the adults with an expression that clearly said, "See? She understands." Derek looked at Sophia, who looked at Carmen, who looked back at her granddaughter sitting peacefully beside a wild bear cub while its mother waited patiently by their ambulance. "In 20 years of emergency medicine, I have never seen anything like this," Derek said quietly. "But that bear is asking us to help her baby, and this child somehow arranged the whole thing." Sophia felt her medical training kicking in despite the impossibility of the situation. "The nearest veterinary hospital is 30 minutes away. Our hospital has surgical equipment and antibiotics. If we're going to save this cub's life, we need to act fast." Ruby seemed to understand every word. She carefully lifted herself up and toddled toward the ambulance, then turned back and made encouraging sounds to the bear cub. The little animal actually tried to stand up and follow her. The mother bear made another soft sound and gently picked up her cub again. She carried it to the back of the ambulance and looked expectantly at the humans. Derek shook his head in amazement. "I'm going to lose my job for this, but I can't say no to a baby who can talk to bears." But as they prepared to load the impossible passengers, none of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, or the man inside taking photographs of everything that was happening. Ruby's gift was about to attract attention from people who had very different plans for a child who could communicate with wild animals. Derek carefully placed a soft blanket in the back of the ambulance, while Sophia prepared a makeshift bed for the injured cub. The mother bear watched every movement with intense focus, occasionally making soft rumbling sounds that Ruby seemed to understand perfectly. Each time the mother bear made a sound, Ruby would respond with her own gentle noises, creating what looked like a detailed conversation about the medical procedures. "She's telling the mother what we're doing," Carmen whispered to Sophia in Spanish. "Look at how the bear relaxes every time Ruby makes those sounds." Sophia had delivered hundreds of babies, treated countless emergencies, But nothing in her medical training had prepared her for watching her 17-month-old daughter serve as a translator between humans and wild bears. Ruby crawled into the ambulance first, patting the blanket and making encouraging sounds toward the bear cub. The mother bear gently placed her baby on the blanket, but as Derek started to close the ambulance doors, she made a distressed sound and put her massive paw on the door frame. Ruby immediately became agitated, pointing at the mother bear and then at herself. She wanted the mother to come too. "Absolutely not," Derek said firmly. "I'm already breaking every protocol by transporting a wild animal. I cannot have a full-grown bear in my ambulance." But Ruby's distress was affecting the injured cub, who began whimpering and trying to get off the blanket. The mother bear's anxiety was visible as she paced back and forth, making sounds that were clearly asking what was wrong. Carmen had an idea. "Ruby, tell the mama bear that you'll take care of her baby. Tell her you'll bring the baby back." Ruby looked at her grandmother with surprise, as if she hadn't thought of this solution. She turned to the mother bear and made a series of complex sounds, ending with what sounded almost like a promise. She placed her hand over her heart, then pointed to the bear cub, then back to her heart. The mother bear stopped pacing and stared directly into Ruby's eyes for what felt like an eternity. Then she made one long, mournful sound and stepped back from the ambulance. Ruby crawled to the edge of the ambulance and extended her tiny hand toward the massive bear. The mother bear gently touched Ruby's palm with the tip of her claw, a gesture so tender and trusting that Sophia felt tears streaming down her face. "She just made a promise to a wild bear," Sophia whispered, and the bear believed her. As they prepared to leave, Carmen suddenly remembered something that made her blood run cold. "Sophia, what about the man in the car? He's been taking pictures." They all turned to look across the street, but the black sedan was gone. In its place was a white van with tinted windows and no license plates visible from their angle. Derek noticed their concern. "We need to get moving. This cub needs medical attention now, and honestly, the fewer people who see this, the better for everyone involved." Ruby settled beside the bear cub, her small hand resting gently on its uninjured side. The moment they started driving, something magical happened. Ruby began humming a lullaby, and the bear cub's labored breathing became calm and steady. Its eyes, which had been clouded with pain, became bright and alert. "Sophia, look at this," Derek called from the driver's seat, watching through the rearview mirror. The cub's vital signs are actually improving. Heart rate is stabilizing. Breathing is deeper. How is that possible? Sophia checked the simple pulse monitor Derek had attached to the cub's paw. He was right. The animal's condition was actually getting better during the drive, not worse as she would have expected with blood loss and trauma. Ruby continued her soft humming, occasionally pausing to make gentle sounds to the cub, who would respond with tiny huffs and whimpers. They seemed to be having an ongoing conversation that somehow kept the injured animal calm and stable. "This is impossible," Sophia muttered, but the evidence was right in front of her. Her daughter wasn't just communicating with the bear. She was somehow healing it through that communication. Halfway to the hospital, Derek's radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, this is dispatch. We've received reports of a missing child and dangerous wildlife in your area. Please respond with your current status." Derek and Sophia exchanged worried glances. Someone had called in a report, but who? And how did they know about Ruby and the bears? "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. We are en route to Willowbrook General with a medical emergency. No missing children in our vehicle." "Copy that, Unit 47. Be advised that Animal Control and Police are being dispatched to 847 Pine Street for a report of a child in danger from wild animals." Carmen's address. Someone had specifically reported Ruby being in danger, even though anyone watching would have seen that the bears were protecting her, not threatening her. Ruby seemed to sense the adult's anxiety. She looked up at Sophia and said her third word, safe. But as they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Sophia realized that Ruby might be wrong this time. A crowd had already gathered outside the emergency entrance. Hospital staff, but also men in dark suits who definitely didn't look like medical personnel. And in the back of the crowd, Sophia spotted the white van from their neighborhood. Derek parked the ambulance, but before anyone could move, one of the men in suits approached the vehicle. He flashed a badge too quickly for anyone to read it clearly. "I'm Agent Marcus Webb with the Department of Wildlife Protection," he said through the window. "We understand you have an unauthorized wild animal in your vehicle and a child who may be in danger." Ruby heard the word danger and immediately became protective of the bear cub. She wrapped her arms around the small animal and made sounds that were clearly defensive. The bear cub responded by nuzzling closer to Ruby, and for the first time since they'd found it, it showed signs of real strength. "Sir," Sophia said carefully, "there's no danger here. My daughter has a special connection with animals, and she's helping this injured cub." Agent Webb's eyes lit up with interest that made Sophia's skin crawl. "A special connection? Can you be more specific about your daughter's abilities?" Derek stepped out of the ambulance and positioned himself between the agent and the back doors. "This animal needs immediate medical attention. Whatever questions you have can wait until after we've treated its injuries." But Agent Webb wasn't alone. 3 more men in suits had surrounded the ambulance, and Sophia noticed that none of them looked particularly concerned about the bear cub's welfare. Their attention was focused entirely on Ruby. Ruby must have sensed the threat because she made a sound unlike any they'd heard from her before, a call that seemed to echo through the air with unusual power. Within seconds, birds began gathering in the trees around the hospital parking lot. Dozens of them, then hundreds, all sitting quietly but watching the scene below with obvious interest. Then they heard it, a deep, answering call from the direction of the forest. The mother bear was responding to Ruby's call and she was getting closer. Agent Webb stepped back from the ambulance, speaking quickly into a radio. "Base, this is Webb. The child's abilities are beyond what we expected. Request immediate backup and containment protocols." Sophia felt her world tilting as she realized these men weren't here to protect Ruby from the bears. They were here to take Ruby away from her family, and the bears might be the only thing standing in their way. Ruby looked directly at her mother and spoke her 4th word, with a clarity that shocked everyone present. "Help." But this time, she wasn't asking the humans for help. She was asking something much larger and more powerful, and the forest around Willowbrook was beginning to answer her call. The hospital's automatic doors slid open as Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the chief of emergency medicine, rushed outside. She had worked with Sophia for years and knew something extraordinary was happening when her best nurse arrived in an ambulance with her baby daughter and what appeared to be government agents surrounding them. "Sophia, what's going on here?" Dr. Reynolds demanded, but her words were nearly drowned out by the sound of hundreds of birds calling from the trees above. The sound was getting louder, more urgent, as if every creature in the forest was trying to send a message. Agent Webb stepped forward, his badge now clearly visible. "Doctor, we need to speak with you about the child. We have reason to believe she poses a significant risk to public safety." Ruby heard the words risk and safety, and her small face crumpled with confusion. She looked at her mother with tears in her eyes, as if asking why these strangers were saying scary things about her. The bear cub, sensing Ruby's distress, tried to stand up despite its injuries and made protective sounds toward the agents. Dr. Reynolds looked into the ambulance and saw something that defied every piece of medical knowledge she possessed. A 17-month-old baby was gently stroking an injured bear cub, and the animal was not only calm but appeared to be getting stronger under the child's touch. "Agent Webb," Dr. Reynolds said firmly, "I don't care what department you're from. That injured animal needs immediate medical attention, and I will not allow you to interfere with emergency medical treatment." "Doctor, you don't understand the scope of what we're dealing with," Agent Webb replied, but his words were interrupted by a commotion from the forest behind the hospital. The mother bear had arrived, but she wasn't alone. 3 more adult bears emerged from the tree line, followed by a pack of wolves, several deer, and what looked like every raccoon, fox, and small mammal within miles. They didn't approach the hospital, but they formed a semicircle at the edge of the parking lot, all facing the ambulance where Ruby sat with the injured cub. Ruby saw her forest friends and clapped her hands excitedly, making happy sounds toward them. Each group of animals responded with their own calls, creating a symphony of wildlife that brought traffic on the nearby highway to a complete stop as drivers pulled over to witness the impossible gathering. "Jesus Christ," Derek whispered. "She just called every animal in the county." Agent Webb was speaking rapidly into his radio again. "Base, we have a code red situation. The subject has attracted multiple large predators to a civilian area. We need tranquilizer units and containment teams immediately." Sophia felt her maternal instincts flare into protective rage. "Tranquilizer units? You want to hurt these animals that are trying to protect my daughter? Mrs. Martinez, your daughter is not in control of her abilities. She's created a dangerous situation that could result in multiple casualties," Agent Webb said, but his explanation was interrupted by Ruby herself. The baby stood up in the ambulance and made a series of sounds that were unlike anything she had produced before. They were complex, layered, almost like she was conducting an orchestra of different animal languages all at once. Every animal in the parking lot stopped moving and listened intently. Then Ruby pointed at the injured bear cub and made one clear sound. Immediately, the mother bear began walking slowly toward the ambulance, followed by the other animals in perfect formation. They weren't charging or acting aggressively. They were approaching like a medical team responding to an emergency. Dr. Reynolds watched in amazement as the mother bear reached the ambulance and gently nuzzled her injured cub. The other animals arranged themselves in a protective circle around the vehicle, but their attention wasn't focused on the humans. They were all watching Ruby, waiting for her next instruction. "She's not out of control," Dr. Reynolds said with wonder in her voice. "She's completely in control. They're following her directions." Agent Webb's backup arrived in the form of 3 black SUVs filled with men carrying tranquilizer guns and containment equipment. But as they stepped out of their vehicles, every animal in the parking lot turned to look at them with expressions that were unmistakably hostile. Ruby saw the weapons and her demeanor changed instantly. She made a sharp, alarmed sound, and the mother bear immediately positioned herself between the tranquilizer guns and the ambulance. The wolves moved to flank the SUVs, while the birds above began calling in what sounded like alarm cries. "Stand down," Agent Webb called to his team. "Do not fire unless directly threatened." But Ruby wasn't finished. She looked directly at Agent Webb and spoke her 5th word, with a force that made everyone present take a step back. "No." The word seemed to echo through the air with unnatural power, and every animal present responded by taking one step closer to the humans with weapons. The message was clear. If these men tried to hurt Ruby or her animal friends, they would have to go through an army of forest creatures to do it. Dr. Reynolds made a decision that would change her career forever. She walked to the back of the ambulance and carefully lifted the injured bear cub, cradling it like she would a human infant. "We're taking this patient inside for treatment," she announced. "Anyone who tries to stop us will have to explain to the medical board why they interfered with emergency care." Ruby clapped her hands and made encouraging sounds as Dr. Reynolds carried the cub toward the hospital entrance. Sophia picked up her daughter and followed, while Derek grabbed the medical supplies from the ambulance. Agent Webb started to object, but the mother bear made a low growling sound that suggested he would be wise to remain silent. The other animals maintained their protective formation as the medical team moved toward the hospital. Inside the emergency room, chaos erupted as nurses and doctors saw Dr. Reynolds carrying a bear cub while a baby made soothing sounds to keep the wild animal calm. But Ruby's influence extended beyond just wild animals. Even the hospital's therapy dogs came running from different departments, all drawn by some invisible signal that only they could detect. Ruby was placed in a wheelchair next to the examination table where the bear cub lay. As Dr. Reynolds began cleaning the wound, Ruby continued her soft humming and gentle sounds. The cub remained perfectly still, as if it understood that the strange procedures were meant to help. "This is remarkable, Doctor," Reynolds murmured as she examined the injury. "The wound is already showing signs of healing that should take days to develop. It's like the cub's immune system has been supercharged." Sophia watched her daughter work what could only be described as miracles, but her joy was tempered by the knowledge that Agent Webb and his team were still outside, waiting for their opportunity to take Ruby away. Through the hospital windows, they could see the standoff continuing in the parking lot. The animals hadn't moved, and neither had the government agents. But Sophia noticed something that made her heart race with fear. More black vehicles were arriving, and these ones had equipment that looked far more serious than tranquilizer guns. Ruby must have sensed her mother's fear because she looked up from the bear cub and made a sound that was both question and comfort. She reached out her tiny hand toward Sophia, and when her mother took it, Sophia felt a wave of calm that she couldn't explain. "It's okay, mija," Sophia whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting Ruby or herself. "Everything will be okay." But even as she said the words, Sophia could see Agent Webb through the window, speaking on a satellite phone with someone who was clearly giving him orders that would change everything. Ruby finished helping Dr. Reynolds bandage the bear cub's wound, then did something that no one expected. She kissed the cub gently on its forehead, whispered something that sounded like a blessing in a language that predated human speech, and then looked directly at her mother with eyes that seemed ancient beyond her months. "Home," Ruby said clearly, her sixth word carrying weight that made everyone in the room understand that she wasn't just talking about their house on Pine Street. Ruby was talking about the forest, the animals, and a world where communication between species was not just possible, but necessary for survival. And Agent Webb's phone call was about to make that world a battleground. Agent Webb closed his satellite phone and turned to his team with an expression that sent chills through everyone watching from inside the hospital. He gestured toward the building, and Sophia saw him mouth words that made her blood run cold. "Bring her in. Alive." Dr. Reynolds noticed the change in the agent's posture immediately. "Sophia, take Ruby to the pediatric ward, lock the door, and don't come out until I give you the all clear." But Ruby had other plans. The moment she heard the urgency in Dr. Reynolds' voice, she looked out the window at her animal friends and made a sound that was part whistle, part song, and part something that had no name in human language. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The mother bear, who had been sitting patiently near the ambulance, stood up and walked directly to the hospital's main entrance. She didn't break the glass or force her way in. She simply sat down in front of the automatic doors, preventing them from closing. The other bears followed her lead, positioning themselves at every entrance to the building. Meanwhile, the birds above began a coordinated dive toward the government vehicles, They weren't attacking the agents, but they were making it impossible for the men to see or move freely. Hundreds of crows, hawks, robins, and even tiny sparrows created a living curtain between the agents and the hospital. "What the hell is happening out there?" one of the nurses called out, staring through the windows at what looked like a scene from a nature documentary gone wrong. Ruby clapped her hands excitedly and made happy sounds toward the bear cub, who was now sitting up on the examination table, despite having been near death an hour earlier. The little bear responded with playful huffs and actually tried to climb down to reach Ruby. Dr. Reynolds caught the cub before it could fall. "This is medically impossible," she whispered. "This animal should be weak for days, maybe weeks. Instead, it's completely healed." Sophia knelt beside Ruby's wheelchair. "Mija, are those men trying to hurt you?" Ruby looked at her mother with eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her 17 months. She pointed toward the window where Agent Webb was shouting orders at his team. Then she shook her head and made a sad sound. "Bad," Ruby said, her seventh word carrying a weight of understanding that shocked everyone present. She knew these men meant harm, and she was protecting not just herself, but everyone she cared about. Agent Webb's voice crackled through a megaphone from outside. "Dr. Reynolds, we know you can hear us. We need the child brought outside immediately. This is a matter of national security." National security. The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. They weren't just going to take Ruby away. They were going to classify her as some kind of weapon or threat to the country. Ruby heard the megaphone and made a sound that none of them had heard before. A low, rumbling call that seemed to come from deep in her chest. Every animal outside responded immediately. The bears moved closer to the building. The wolves began pacing in perfect formation around the parking lot, and even the smaller animals like raccoons and squirrels emerged from hiding to join the growing assembly. But the most shocking response came from creatures no one had expected. The ground around the hospital began to vibrate slightly, and through the basement windows they could see earthworms, beetles, and other underground creatures emerging from the soil. Ruby's call had reached every living thing within miles. Dr. Reynolds stared at the scene outside in amazement. She's not just communicating with them, she's commanding an entire ecosystem. Agent Webb tried a different approach. His voice came through the megaphone again, but this time it was softer, more persuasive. "Ruby, we know you can hear us. We're not here to hurt you. We want to help you learn about your special gift. Don't you want to meet other children like you?" Ruby's head snapped up at these words. She looked at her mother with curiosity and made questioning sounds. "Other children like her?" Sophia could see the interest in her daughter's eyes, and it terrified her. "Don't listen to him, baby," Sophia whispered. "There are no other children like you. You're special, you're unique, and you're ours." But Ruby was already crawling toward the window, trying to see the man who claimed there were others like her. The bear cub followed her, its small paws making soft padding sounds on the hospital floor. Carmen, who had been quietly praying in the corner, suddenly stood up with alarm in her eyes. "Mija, no. My grandmother told me stories about men like this. They came to our village in Mexico looking for children with gifts. The children they took were never seen again." Ruby heard the fear in her great-grandmother's voice and immediately returned to her side, making comforting sounds. But the damage was done. Agent Webb had planted the seed of curiosity about other children with similar abilities. Dr. Reynolds made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She picked up the hospital's internal phone and dialed security. "This is Dr. Reynolds. I need all available security personnel to the emergency department immediately. We have government agents attempting to kidnap a patient." Agent Webb's response was swift and chilling. 3 more black SUVs arrived, followed by a large truck that looked like it belonged to a military operation rather than a wildlife protection agency. Men in tactical gear began unloading equipment that was clearly designed for capturing and containing something much more dangerous than a 17-month-old baby. Ruby saw the new arrivals, and her demeanor changed completely. The playful, curious baby disappeared, replaced by something ancient and protective. She made a sound that was both warning and war cry, and every animal outside responded as if they had been waiting for this exact signal. The mother bear stood up on her hind legs, reaching nearly 8 feet tall, and roared with a sound that shattered several car windows in the parking. The wolves began howling in harmony, while the birds above created a deafening cacophony of calls. But most terrifying of all were the sounds coming from the forest itself. Deep, rumbling calls from creatures that sounded much larger than bears. "My God," Derek whispered, staring out the window. "What else is out there?" Ruby looked at her family, Sophia, Carmen, Doctor, Reynolds, Derek, and even the bear cub that had become part of their group. She seemed to be making a decision that would affect all of their lives. She crawled to Sophia and placed her tiny hands on her mother's face. Looking directly into Sophia's eyes, Ruby spoke 3 words that would haunt Sophia forever. "Ruby, keep safe." It wasn't "Ruby, stay safe" or "keep Ruby safe." It was "Ruby, keep safe," meaning she would be the one doing the protecting, not the one being protected. Sophia realized with growing horror that her baby daughter was preparing to sacrifice herself to keep her family and animal friends safe from the men outside. Ruby was going to surrender herself to Agent Webb to prevent a battle that could hurt the people and creatures she loved. But before anyone could stop her, Ruby made one final sound, a call that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The response from the forest was immediate and overwhelming. Trees began to move. Not swaying in the wind, but actually moving, their roots pulling up from the ground as ancient oaks and maples began walking toward the hospital like slow, massive guardians. The sight was so impossible, so terrifying and beautiful at the same time, that even Agent Webb's tactical team stopped what they were doing to stare in amazement. Ruby had called upon the forest itself, and the forest was answering. The battle for Ruby's freedom was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. Agent Webb grabbed his radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is Webb. We need immediate evacuation of all civilian personnel from a 5-mile radius. The situation has escalated beyond our containment capabilities. Request immediate authorization for Protocol 7. Sophia didn't know what Protocol 7 meant, but the fear in Agent Webb's voice told her it was something that would change everything. Ruby had awakened something in the natural world that had been sleeping for centuries, and now both she and the forest were preparing to defend themselves against forces that wanted to control powers they didn't understand. The bear cub nuzzled against Ruby's leg and made a soft sound that seemed to ask if she was ready. Ruby looked around at all the faces watching her, human and animal alike, and nodded with the solemnity of someone far older than her 17 months. The final battle was about to begin, and Ruby Martinez was going to lead an army of nature against the most powerful government in the world. But as Ruby prepared to face the impossible odds outside, something unexpected happened. The bear cub, now fully healed and glowing with the same gentle energy that surrounded Ruby, climbed into her lap and made a sound that was part purr, part song. Ruby looked down at the little creature she had saved, and her expression changed from one of ancient determination to something much simpler and more powerful. Love. Ruby wrapped her tiny arms around the bear cub and made a sound that was different from all her previous calls. This one was soft, peaceful, and filled with such pure emotion that it seemed to wash over everyone present like a warm embrace. The sound carried through the hospital walls, across the parking lot, and into the forest beyond. The response was immediate and breathtaking. Agent Webb, who had been shouting orders into his radio, suddenly stopped mid-sentence and stared at the hospital with confusion. His tactical team lowered their weapons, not out of surrender, but because they found themselves overwhelmed by a feeling of peace they couldn't explain. The massive bears that had been prepared for battle sat down gently and began making soft, rumbling sounds. The wolves stopped their defensive pacing and lay down in the grass, their heads resting on their paws. Even the walking trees slowed their approach and stood still, their branches swaying gently as if moved by a breeze that carried Ruby's message of love and protection. Inside the hospital, Dr. Reynolds found herself wiping away tears she couldn't explain. "What is she doing?" she whispered. Carmen smiled through her own tears, recognizing something her grandmother had told her about long ago. "She's not fighting them, mija. She's showing them what they're really fighting." Ruby continued to hold the bear cub while making her peaceful sounds, and slowly, one by one, the government agents began to lower their weapons. They couldn't explain why, but the idea of capturing this child suddenly seemed not just wrong, but impossible. How could they imprison someone who radiated such pure love and connection to all living things? Agent Webb found himself walking toward the hospital entrance, not with the intention of capturing Ruby, but with a strange desire to understand what he was witnessing. The mother bear, who should have been his greatest threat, simply watched him approach with calm, intelligent eyes. As Webb reached the hospital doors, Ruby looked directly at him through the window and spoke her final word, the 8th word that would change everything: friend. The word hit Agent Webb like a physical force, and he realized with stunning clarity that everything he had been told about Ruby was wrong. She wasn't a threat to be contained or a weapon to be controlled. She was something the world had been waiting for without knowing it. A bridge between humanity and the natural world that could heal the growing divide between civilization and nature. Webb slowly holstered his weapon and spoke into his radio with a voice that trembled with emotion. "Base, this is Agent Webb. Mission is canceled. The subject poses no threat to national security. Repeat, no threat. Recommend immediate withdrawal of all tactical teams." The voice on the radio crackled with confusion and anger, but Webb simply turned off the device and looked back at Ruby, who was smiling at him through the window while the bear cub played happily in her lap. Dr. Reynolds opened the hospital doors, and Agent Webb walked inside, followed by several of his team members who seemed equally affected by Ruby's peaceful presence. They moved slowly, carefully, like people entering a sacred space. Ruby looked up at Agent Webb and made a soft questioning sound, tilting her head as if asking if he was okay. The gesture was so genuinely caring, so completely free of fear or anger despite everything he had put her through, that Webb fell to his knees beside her wheelchair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. We didn't understand." Ruby reached out her tiny hand and gently touched Webb's face, making comforting sounds just as she had with the injured bear cub. In that moment, Webb understood that Ruby's gift wasn't just about communicating with animals. It was about healing the broken connections between all living things. Sophia watched in amazement as her daughter, who had been prepared to sacrifice herself to save her family, instead chose to save her enemies by showing them love instead of fear. Over the following hours, something miraculous happened. The government tactical teams packed up their equipment and left, but many of the agents remained behind as volunteers. They helped Dr. Reynolds set up a temporary wildlife treatment center in the hospital parking lot, where Ruby could continue helping injured animals while being surrounded by her human family. Agent Webb resigned from his position and became Ruby's protector, ensuring that no other government agency would ever try to take her away from her family. He established a foundation to study and protect children with unusual abilities, making sure they were supported rather than exploited. The bear cub, now completely healthy and bonded to Ruby for life, became a permanent resident of the wildlife sanctuary that was built next to the Martinez family home. The mother bear and her forest friends visited regularly, creating a unique community where humans and animals lived in harmony. As the sun set on that extraordinary day, Ruby sat in her grandmother's arms, the bear cub sleeping peacefully beside her. The forest had returned to its normal stillness, but somehow everything felt different, more connected, more alive. Dr. Reynolds, who had witnessed the impossible, documented everything that had happened. Her report would eventually lead to new fields of study about interspecies communication and the healing power of unconditional love. But for now, she was content to watch Ruby play with her bear friend and know that she had witnessed something that would change the world. Sophia looked at her daughter, this miraculous child who had turned what should have been a terrifying ordeal into a lesson about love, compassion, and the power of choosing peace over violence. Ruby had shown them all that the greatest strength isn't in fighting your enemies but in helping them become your friends. Carmen smiled as she watched Ruby gently stroke the sleeping bear cub. "Just like your great-great-grandmother," she whispered. "She always said the gift wasn't about controlling animals, it was about healing hearts." Ruby looked up at her great-grandmother and made a soft, happy sound that seemed to say she understood. Then she yawned, a perfectly normal baby yawn, and curled up next to her bear friend for a nap. As the family prepared to take Ruby home, Agent Webb approached Sophia one last time. "Mrs. Martinez, your daughter didn't just save that bear cub today, she saved all of us. She showed us that there's a better way to handle things we don't understand." Sophia nodded, looking at her sleeping daughter with wonder and pride. She's always been special, but today she taught us that being special isn't about being different from others. It's about helping others feel connected. The story of Ruby Martinez and the bear cub spread around the world, not as a tale of government conspiracy or supernatural powers, but as a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes come from the smallest acts of love and compassion. And in the quiet town of Willowbrook, a baby who could speak to animals had spoken to something much more important, the human heart. She had shown everyone that the greatest magic in the world isn't the ability to control others, but the power to help them choose love over fear. Ruby had waved down an ambulance to save a wounded bear cub, but in the end she had healed something much more significant, the broken connection between humanity and the natural world, one heart at a time. The bear cub lived a long and happy life, never far from Ruby's side, serving as a living reminder that sometimes the most shocking thing that can happen is when love wins over everything else. And they all lived not just happily ever after, but connected ever after. In a world where understanding replaced fear, and where a baby's simple act of compassion had changed everything.